So, worship services here at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Tampa seem to be getting kind of back to normal, huh? Or at least sort of. Think about it. There's been a 3-year struggle with turmoil within the congregation, a pandemic, Zoom meetings, and virtual worship services. There have been coffee hours without coffee, services without music, no singing aloud, and no choir. And not a lot of programming continuity. Groups unable to meet, social justice projects not started. And why are there so many guest speakers? When was the last witches' masquerade ball? And what about the kids? And did I mention the choir? Seems like we are getting back to normal again. Well, sort of. We still need to stay masked up, but let us stay the course. This particular Sunday, the one right after Labor Day, marks the beginning of the church year in nearly all Unitarian Universalist churches. In-gatherings, homecomings, and/or water communion services all over the place. Water communions began to spring up. Did you get that? In UU congregations in the early 1980s. Now it's become hard to find a congregation that doesn't have one in one form or another. Today is about as close as we get to a Unitarian Universalist holy day or holiday. It seems a natural enough time for a UU holiday. What with schools having started back up and our looking forward to a new congregational year. But you say, wait, you can't just make up a holiday. To which I say, every holiday we celebrate is made up. Why not one more? So this Sunday we have water communion. I fully recognize that some of us would rather call it something else. When we hear communion, many of us think of the Eucharist, the partaking of consecrated bread and wine. It's a ceremony found in Christian churches that ritualizes a particularly close relationship with the Christ. And many of us as Unitarian Universalists just don't quite go there. However, we have communion because it means to have a close relationship. Communion and community share the same Latin root word, communio. Communio means sharing, in common. So community and communion can mean the same thing. So I understand communion to mean a close sharing, in common, a celebration of community, even fellowship. That's what I think about when someone mentions water communion. And isn't celebrating our community a principal reason most of us are here today? But why water? Why call it water communion? We all come from different backgrounds. We bring different gifts. We possess different identities and diverse theologies. But we all have something, a substance in common, closely in common. with one another. And that is water. We must have water in order to live. We all know that water is essential to life. It comprises over 70% of our bodies and is something we share with all known forms of life. And what have they been looking for on Mars but water? In so many ways, even as we have water in considerable quantities and need it to survive, it becomes ever more challenging to acquire it. On a global scale, we face challenging water shortages. If we consider some of the relevant statistics, it's easy to understand why. 3/4 of the Earth's surface is covered by water, but only 1% is fresh water. And of that 1%, 1% is available to us humans for our use. Of that remaining tiny fraction, about 70% is used for agriculture, and 22% is used for industrial production. That leaves about 8% of that tiny amount, relatively tiny amount of accessible fresh water for domestic use by the almost 8 billion human inhabitants on the planet. Fortunately, we have learned to recycle much of the water we consume, but most of that formidable recycling effort is attributable to natural processes, delicate natural processes. And demand on a basically fixed resource grows with growing population. We face growing challenges all over the world with respect to the availability of usable water. Let me share some astonishing statistics about our need for water, examples that go far beyond the notion that we just need to drink a lot of it every day. It takes 132 gallons of water. That's about 1,056 pounds of water to grow a pound of wheat. Potatoes seem to represent a more efficient proposition. They require only 66 gallons per pound. A single cup of coffee requires some 1,100 cups of water. It's about 550 pounds to produce. Think about that at coffee hour a little later on here. Obviously, much of this needed water is delivered naturally through precipitation, rivers, aquifers, and so forth. It's not that we have to empty our water heaters every time we want a cup of coffee. But the water does have to come from somewhere. Even if we just make use of it temporarily to bathe or wash dishes. We have gone a long way in our Western culture toward taking water for granted. Indeed, we need to consider that we average in this country direct use of about 185 gallons per day per person. In West Africa, they get by, if you can call it that, on about 7.6 gallons per day. Yet we cannot help but juxtapose the view of water as a scarce, precious, essential resource with memorable experiences of water. Water is a dangerous, powerful, frightening source of destruction at times. and death. It seems to me a great, perhaps divine irony. Too much water, accompanied by other destructive natural forces, can be as deadly as too little water. Water is critical, necessary, and dangerous, and is perhaps the closest thing we've got to a universal metaphor. Our human experience is filled with stories and myths where water is central. From many of the world's creation stories to the divinely ordered floods that cleansed Babylon and led to that story being culturally appropriated by the Hebrew people to become the story of Noah. There was the parting of the Red Sea to enable escape from slavery. More recently, there was the mythical Northwest Passage, a water route across America to Asia. And that now appears entirely practical thanks to the effects of climate change on the Arctic ice. What these stories share is that water harbors great potential power, the power to do good and the power to harm. It is far more than a benign substance that puddles up on the sidewalk after a rain shower. Water has more than one side to it, just as our communities do. Water in communities can be benign, but they are also dangerous. They can lead to subversive revolutions, such as lifting up of civil rights and a host of social justice issues. In the Hebrew Bible, the prophet Amos cries out for all to let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Powerful metaphors indeed. When I experience a UU water communion, I'm always impressed by the geographic diversity of our summer travels and activities. Some of them far away, some close to home. Some are remembered joyously. Some are more closely connected with human suffering that visits itself upon all of us at various times. Our waters come from far and wide, yet we mingle our waters together gently, peacefully, as we mingle our lives together. We see that our waters really have no trouble mixing with that of others in our community. No one's water is better or more impressive than someone else's. Altogether, the molecules of water we will contribute conform to their container. They appear at peace, and yet our experience with water reminds us that there is power in all that collection of submicroscopic molecules. Just as this religious community has power to carry out its will. What is the will of water here on earth? Now, permit me a somewhat philosophical answer, I suppose. The will of water seems to be to seek its own level. It flows so as to do so. It goes around obstacles, but it does not leave those obstacles unaffected. They are warned ever so slowly. They respond to the water, and they are forever changed. just as we are forever changed from our experience in this religious community. We are affected by one another just a little bit at a time. We do not exist only to plod through life in isolation from one another. And so this ingathering Sunday provides an opportunity to reflect on such phenomena deliberately. And the sharing of our water stories helps to inform that reflection. It is part of an ingathering for us to do this together because we are in community. The water can stand for many things, just as this community can stand for many things. It is good to come together. For those whose presence we have missed in past years, for those who are contemplating becoming a part of this religious community, and for those active community members who feel a need to celebrate, to renew their ongoing participation in this community. We gather together, and yet we come home to change. Change, whether gradual or dramatic, may very well be much like water. We cannot live without it. We may not wish to see it that way, but perhaps we should try. May we nourish one another in the coming congregational year. May we grow in love. May we grow with one another. And may we celebrate throughout the year the strengths of this religious community as its flow continues into its future. So might it be, and amen.